Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to talk about the Senate race, of course, but I want to start a little bit more soberly by talking about the big news of the week. Very serious, national scandal, allegations of corruption at the highest level, consuming a lot of our attention, and I want to put you in the position of making a hard call. Should the Astros lose the World Series title?
You know I'm not going to say my Astros should lose the World Series title.
Isn't anyone going to be held accountable in this country for cheating? I mean, today, literally, council member, literally today, the L.A. City Council. You may know some folks on the City Council in L.A. from your time on the City Council in Houston. They're going to vote today on the L.A. City Council to ask the major leagues to strip from the Red Sox and the Astros the World Series title and give them both to the Dodgers, who lost to the Astros and lost to the Red Sox.
To which I say the Dodgers have an ample shot to win it on their own.
Okay.
All the right. So the Astros get to keep the championship.
You get to keep the championship. Okay. That may be the biggest news you make today. We'll find out. You see what I did there? But seriously, let me ask you about impeachment. You know that the articles were conveyed from the House to the Senate yesterday. Senate trial is going to begin. And if you were in the United States Senate, if you were, if we sort of somehow did kind of a time warp thing, right? So the seat you seek now, if you happen to be in the United States Senate right now, you would be one of 100 impartial jurors sworn in today. Could you be impartial, Ms. Edwards, going into this and say, I want to consider the evidence and not have an opinion formed? Every one of your fellow candidates I've talked to has said, hell yes, we'd impeach him. Hell yes, we'd remove him. But you're a lawyer. You know how this works. Aren't you supposed to be impartial? And could you be impartial?
The answer is yes. I could be impartial because it's my responsibility to be impartial. Now, certainly we have heard, and I mean, we know this. As a lawyer, you see these things play out, and sometimes you have a trial in the public arena before you actually have a real trial. And you know that the responsibility is always to weigh the facts, weigh the evidence as presented. And so it's my responsibility as a U.S. Senator to take that responsibility very seriously and do just, in fact, that. I've been very careful not to, of course, I see what everyone else sees in terms of the way the evidence appears, but until it's formally presented, you have to withhold that firm judgment because that is what it's about. You're supposed to be able to have that due process.
So you look me in the face with a straight face, look folks here with a straight face, look them in the eye and say that you don't have a point of view about the outcome of this.
I have some sense that it doesn't look great in terms of what the evidence is showing as far as what I've been made aware of. But until I get myself in that position, you have to take those responsibilities.
Can't say.
You can't say definitively.
Right.
Correct.
Has Senator Cornyn, the person you'd like to displace from this seat, acquitted himself well as far as this process goes?
Absolutely
from the perspective of being an impartial juror?
Absolutely not.
Talk about that.
He has been probably one of the chief advocates for defending the president in this process before evidence was presented. And again, your responsibility in these roles is, in fact, to weigh the evidence as it's been presented to you. So, of course, we can see in the media it certainly looks a particular way. I won't deny that in terms of there being a substantial amount of evidence against the president. But until you sit in that chair and actually weigh that, you really ought to reserve the opportunity to allow the process to play itself out appropriatly because that's the oath you're taking in that role.
Both sides need to stand down. Both sides.
Yeah, you need to take it seriously.
Need to stand down.
And that's part of my background as a
lawyer.
lawyer.
Why on earth are you running? Have you seen the approval ratings of Congress? Have you ever seen the way Congress operates? Why on earth do you want to be in Congress?
I get that question quite a bit.
Yeah.
And you know, the truth of the matter is it's not about being in spaces where you're most comfortable. It's about being in the space that you're most needed. And I think we have come to a time in our country, and it's not to suggest that it's never been bad in terms of polarization and all of these things.
We always tend to romanticize the past. It was never as good as we think it was. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to go in that direction. But what I do want to say is this. We definitely need to change the trajectory of this country and the way leadership is connecting or not connecting to the people that it's intended to serve. And so what my campaign is about is trying to refocus our attention on people and the people who elect us, the accountability that's supposed to extend to people, not necessarily cable news or any other a way that we are heightening or raising the tensions among in this polarizing process,
right.
but instead saying, I should be measured by what happens, what changes in your life. That's what I find to be success in this process, is measure me by the changes that you see in your life. So if I'm on a campaign trail and I'm talking to you about access to healthcare coverage or economic opportunity for all Texans or all Americans even, if those are the things that I'm talking about, then instead of next campaign season, me coming back and just asking for a vote, I should be coming back and saying to you, look what we did together.
What was the ROI?
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's what it should be about.
There are metrics that you're putting in front of people by which you should be.
Exactly, and that
should be
changes
judged.
the paradigm, because instead of it making it about the politician or the elected official, it actually makes it a more functional system for people.
But hasn't,
results.
Council member, hasn't politics always been fundamentally about people? Voters have to approve or disapprove of a candidate for office, an incumbent or a challenger, and they're trying to get people to see how their lives will be made better or changed in some material way by that person in office. So what's different about this? You talk about this, that when you launched your campaign, you said we're powered by people. You know, this is really important to us. You've mentioned a couple times now, people are the focus. But isn't that really just politics always for everybody?
Evan, let me give you this one example. So when Harvey happened in 2017 in Houston, I got a call that was 51 inches of rainfall that came across the community, which is huge. And I got a call to go check on some of our low-income seniors, which I did.
Right.
And I knock on the door and I say, what are you doing to clean out your house? How are you getting your furniture out? They'd say, oh, I'll get my grandchild to help me, et cetera. And when I'd ask the question, what are you doing to remove your walls? They'd say to me, oh, well, they've already dried. And of course, as you know, you can't allow walls that have been soiled by floodwater to just remain in the home.
Right.
And so I mobilized hundreds of volunteers. We were going to go door to door to check on these low-income seniors who needed to get that assistance. So in doing that work, when I'd appear on those doorsteps and I'd be really excited to be trying to be responsive to the needs, one of the first things people would ask was, are you up for re-election? And while it seems like an innocent question,
they assumed this was a transactional visit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so instead of it being, oh, I'm actually here to deposit in your lives or do what I should be doing in a time of need, the immediate question was, it must be election time.
Right.
And what I bring that up to say is that we've conditioned the American public to believe that we know how to find your house when it's time to get a vote from you, but what is it that we find your house when it's time to deposit in your life or deposit into your community?
Okay.
And so it's not just people in isolation, it's the results for people that we need to make this about.
Are you qualified for this office? You've served, I realize that the whole notion of conventional experience for seeking public office has been upturned. Let's just say it's been upturned.
By whose measure, right?
But is one term on the Houston City Council adequate preparation for serving in the United States Senate, for granting the authorization, should the Congress ever be asked to go to war, to make decisions about budgets on the scale that members of the Senate have to make decisions, or to deal with any of the issues in the grand portfolio? You will have served one term on the Houston City Council.
Absolutely.
Is that adequate experience for this office?
Well, it presupposes that I haven't had other experiences.
No, of course. You've had outside politics experience.
Exactly. And I think that when we look at this, it's not that you just start from one position like the city council piece. And so what I want to say is, number one, it makes me extremely prepared to not only bring the stories of people with me, but to also understand how policy actually works or doesn't work on the ground.
Right.
And that's been the disconnect a lot of the time when you hear what's happening in federal government and they say, oh, we'll just cut some of those CDBG dollars. They don't know how the CDBG dollars
Tell people what CDBG means.
Yes, that's Community Development Block Grant dollars.
Okay.
So that's what your local governments will use to do affordable housing in their cities or economic development in the cities. Those are big grant dollars that get dispersed to do a lot of the things.
So you're in a situation to actually know the detail level work enough.
Right, how to actually fix it.
Because you've actually been, look, let's stipulate, you're an at-large member of the council. You had 2.3 million. Houston is the 37th largest state in the country. Right? It's not like you.
I've never heard it put that way.
But that's true.
We usually just say the fourth largest city.
No, but it is true. Houston is by population would be the 37th largest state in the country. It's not like you're the mayor of a city of 100,000 running for president, right? You are a council member in a city of 2.3 million, right? That's actually something. So you really have experience being a member of a city council in Houston is actually different than being a member of a city council in a much smaller
Yeah,
community.
and I think putting you with a large, I mean, and we've had some extraordinary experiences. One of the things I'm really proud of is the tech and innovation work that I started in Houston. When the question was, why are we losing some of our startups? I started a task force, and we are right now under construction for a brand new innovation district for our city. So there are things that, you know, having vision is important, but being able to execute on that vision is critically important and a skill that is desperately needed in Washington.
This gets to the question I want to ask you. What have you actually done in those years as city council that has affected the lives of people? You say people should judge you by the way that their lives have been changed. What accomplishments did you put on the board during those 4 years that you can point to as examples of how you execute?
Great question. So the tech and innovation work, I started that my first year, and now we've got a fund of funds. We've got the innovation district under construction. That's really been an exciting piece to uplift and empower our community with regard to the startup community. Another piece has been one of the things that was striking to me is that minority-owned businesses are about 3 times less likely to gain access to capital than their non-minority business counterparts. That means you've got to get rejected 3 times the number of times
before you get a yes.
Yeah, before you get a yes. Women businesses. So I started the task force for women and minority business owners to try to start to reduce the disparity in terms of not just lending practices, but also how do we prepare our small business owners so that they're ready for those traditional mainstream loans? How do we try to encourage CDFIs, which are they lend primarily majority of their monies to some of these smaller businesses on a community-based level? How do we increase the access to resources for those types of institutions so that we change the flow of capital? These are things that mom and pop shops, community-based organizations, or just small businesses will thrive when they have access to the resources that their counterparts have. So those are ways that you make meaningful, sustainable, long-term change in communities when you open up opportunity for them. Another example would be the Mayor's Complete Communities Initiative. One of the things that I was adamant about is that we don't just go in and go to the communities that are selected and say, here's what's going to make your community complete. Instead, I made sure that we had the community at the table. You know the adage, if you're not at the table, you're what's on the menu, yes?
Right.
Okay. We don't want the community on the menu. We want the community's voice uplifted, and then the vision that we buy into is one that the community has created. When you have that type of buy-in, then you'll have the long-term sustainable change. So those are just a few examples in addition to the work that I've done with Harvey, but I could go on longer. But
This is good. That's good. Tell me about the 4 years you're in the council. What was the biggest miss? What was something that you wanted to do, tried to do, worked on for a long time, couldn't get done? What was the biggest mistake you made? We're all self-aware. We all know the things that we accomplish and don't. Tell us something that you couldn't accomplish or a mistake you made in those 4 years.
Yeah, I would say the one thing I was not able to accomplish that I desperately wish that I had was completely dealing with the high-capacity transit crisis that I think is happening not just in our city, but in our state. One of the things, it's an environmental issue because it reduces carbon footprint for people, but it's also an issue of how to get people connected. And so when you think about in our region, in the region that I represent, there's about 8 counties. In that 8-county region, we are expecting to add in the next couple of decades 4.2 million people to that region. So that places us in a realm similar to Los Angeles in terms of what we could anticipate will be coming in the future in terms of congestion and difficulty getting around. And I really pushed hard for us to invest more in high-capacity transit options rather than, we like to do more freeway and highway expansion. Right now, there's a $7 billion project on the books from TxDOT to expand one of our major freeways without it having enough high-capacity transit options. That's something I really, really would like to see changed, and I certainly built the foundation for that change by making the economic case.
But still think that it should get done
absolutely.
At some point. I love how you talk about these things at the micro level. You're kind of nerding out on local government issues, and it makes me wonder, why didn't you decide to run for mayor? Or why don't you hang around for 2 more years? There'll be statewide elections in 2022. Democrats are always looking for fresh faces, new people to run for statewide office. Why is the better path for you to go federal as opposed to local or state?
I think exactly because of what you said. I actually know how this stuff works.
Yeah.
And that is the disconnect, right? You've got folks in the federal government, they have no idea what this means on the ground. Not everyone, of course, but a number of folks. I know how disaster recovery dollars work from the very top because I've been there and been flying to Washington, D.C., advocating for those dollars.
Yep.
I know how those dollars work, how they flow, how they should flow, and how they don't actually work for people in the current state that they are.
Yep.
And so how to fix that. You need people who are problem solvers, and that's part of having the experience on the ground. That's what that brings me. Yeah. In addition to that, when you think about transit, I've been advocating, I've been a member of the board of the National League of Cities, board of directors, and I've advocated to the Department of Transportation, who has no interest in putting new dollars into the fold and fixing our crumbling infrastructure. And I don't know about you, but I think that's a national issue. How many times do we have to see a bridge crumble or someone's life threatened in terms of realizing, maybe it's time to start investing in the infrastructure in this nation. We've not gotten there yet, and unfortunately, oftentimes it has to be a crisis or some type of peril that is imminent that people then say, okay, well, let's start to invest more. You remember the $1 trillion worth of Trump package that was supposed to happen in transportation funding? Most of that was just
every week is infrastructure week, right?
Right, yeah. Right. And most of that ended up being how localities should tax themselves or tax the consumers. Right. That's not a package. We need real answers. We need high-capacity transit options. We need environmental components. We need healthcare access.
So it's at that level that you can do the most good.
Absolutely.
You think on that basis. Let me ask you about the Democratic Party. I've asked this in one form or another of all of the candidates who've sat across from me during this race. The party ideologically is a continuum. Not everybody lands at the same place on the continuum. There's a lot of talk, especially at a presidential race like the one we're having, about who's progressive, who's moderate, where is the base. As I said, I've asked this of the other candidates. Where do you fit along the continuum of the party? How do you self-define politically?
Yeah, I would say I am a pro-growth Democrat and believe that we need to expand the tent for everybody to fit into it. One of the things I'm really proud of having done is I was a part of a group called the New Deal Leaders, which is basically a lot of pro-growth progressive Democrats who want to see opportunity for a lot of people, but also want to see the economy continue to grow and thrive. And so in doing that work, I led what's called Future of Work Group. And we dealt with the issue. More Americans are actually more afraid of the future of work or the evolution of the economy, automation, the role of that in terms of threatening their jobs, than they are of foreign competition. It used to be the case that people were really scared of globalization and foreign competition. Now it's the case that people are scared that a machine is going to replace me. So while you see it as a consumer, oh, cool, I get a package from, same-day delivery and a drone dropped it off. That's somebody's job or people's jobs that have gone away. What is our answer for that? One of the things I'm really passionate about is having an inclusive answer, not just for urban markets. The answer for people when their jobs have gone away isn't to say to them, I guess you need to move. How do we scale up to rural communities as well?
I want to talk about the rural stuff, which I think is an interesting call out for you, especially in a state like Texas. But let me stay with this idea that you're a pro-growth progressive. That sounds to me like jumbo shrimp. What does it mean to be
But there is jumbo shrimp. You've not been to the Gulf Coast. There's jumbo shrimp.
What does it mean to be a pro-growth? I mean, I'm conscious of what progressive can mean and cannot mean. And, of course, there are progressive Democrats who would say, of course, we're for growth. We're just for a different kind of growth. When you got in this race in July, Senator Cornyn's campaign manager, John Jackson, said this about you. Councilwoman Edwards is a true progressive with a record that would make Elizabeth Warren jealous.
He did say that.
They're trying to paint you as an Elizabeth Warren-style Democrat. But I look at your record, and I actually don't see that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, and I love Elizabeth Warren. I used to work for her. I was her health care contributor on her blog on the middle class when I was in law school. When she was Professor Warren and I was student Amanda, I got a chance to do that. But that doesn't mean that all of our policies are in fact the same.
Healthcare, for instance, I mean, she has been a loud champion of Medicare for all.
Correct.
And you are not a supporter of Medicare for all.
Correct.
Right.
When I was 10 years old, my dad was diagnosed with cancer.
Right.
And in our house, I learned what our U.S. healthcare system was by virtue of finding out or asking questions about my dad's treatment and whether it was going to be covered. And I remember my dad, when I'd ask him, is it going to be covered, because he was getting experimental treatments for his form of cancer, he would say, well, we'll see. And I'd say, well, what happens if they say no? And my dad would say, well, we'll have to figure something else out.
Right.
I'd say, well, what happens if somebody can't figure something else out? And the answer for me and the answer for so many people in America is that these are life or death questions. Fortunately for us, my dad did have good health care coverage. He did pass away when I was 17, but because he had coverage, he stayed that long. And so I think about young people like I was, and knowing that we can't afford to wait another 5 or 6 or 7 years to debate the issue of Medicare for all in Washington. We need people who know how to act now. I think we can formulate consensus on fixing and improving and expanding the Affordable Care Act by having a public option as it was initially intended.
So this is really, it's Medicare for all who want it. So if people want to opt into a public option, that's fine.
Yes.
But you're not looking to get rid of private insurance.
Correct.
And if I want to keep my current situation,
that is correct.
You're good with this. So
That's right.
This is more the Biden-Buttigieg. If you look at this in the terms of presidential race,
yeah.
This is more the Biden-Buttigieg end of the conversation than the Warren-Sanders.
Yeah, and Cornyn didn't put anything about Biden and Buttigieg in my this quote about me.
Or his campaign manager. No, that's right. And it is really, again, your own experience with the system that shapes your view of where we should go and how far we should go and how far we shouldn't go.
And my experience on this whole concept of the deliverables, right? I think we have to be when we're talking about these issues to the public, and we know that every time I say something, I'm either restoring someone's confidence in government or I'm eroding it, whether we're intending to do so or not, because that's that one thing that somebody grabbed onto and they said, oh, this person's going to do this for me. Do I think we're going to have the consensus to get Medicare for all at this stage? No, I don't. Do I think we can have consensus to form a public option? I think we can. Now, is it going to be a push and a little bit of a stretch? Yes, it will.
Yeah, and don't you think the energy in the party, candidly, right now appears to be more in the realm of let's put the ball in the end zone than just run 3 yards and punt?
Yeah, I think we'll be able to get there this time. Now, when the Affordable Care Act, I mean, you got to take yourself back to when President Obama was in office and how much political capital he had to expend just to get to the ACA. And we didn't even think it was going to pass, if you remember. They thought it was dead. And so just to get to that point, the fact that the public option came out is no surprise. But I think now we're at a stage where people are ready for that.
Acknowledging this is a more moderate position in the Democratic Party of today and in this.
Absolutely.
On guns. You are out as opposing mandatory buybacks of assault weapons.
Yeah, so I'm someone who was in high school when Columbine happened, and we have made very little to almost no progress in terms of what we've seen come out of Washington, D.C. in terms of policy changes. I think we start where there's consensus. 90% of Americans believe there should be background checks. We obviously need to start there, but I don't think this conversation starts with mandatory buybacks. I think the conversation starts with how do we put reasonable, common sense policies in place that there is consensus on first, and then, of course, have the discussion. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be restrictions.
Well, let's talk about that because I want to put you out on the record on that because here is, we're in a very Second Amendment focused state. There are many of our fellow Texans who believe very strongly that they should not have their access to guns restricted in any way. The polls are actually more in line with what you said than state leaders have been, right? But let's go through this. So universal background checks, you're for that?
Yes.
Are you for a ban on high-capacity magazines?
Yes.
You are. Are you for red flag laws?
Yes.
Should we have a ban on assault weapons, even if we don't go full-on confiscation?
Yeah, we don't need to go full-on confiscation. I think that tips us into a different realm of not being able to get it done. And I think we've got to be serious about investing our energies in the space where we think we may be able to get it done. So no on the confiscation piece, but the restrictions, yes.
So let me ask you about this. So I was in Lufkin this summer to do an event with a couple of state legislators, Representative Trent Ashby and Senator Robert Nichols, who represent East Texas. These are folks who are in the legislature who are conservatives in a very conservative part of the state, very conservative constituency. It was right after the shooting in El Paso. A moment when you would imagine people would be softened up. Their opposition to any restrictions changing would be softened up by the events that had just happened, the tragedy that had happened. And the mood in the room, on stage and in the room, was not just no to restrictions on guns a couple days after El Paso, it was hell no. How do you move people, even after El Paso happened? Odessa had not happened yet, right? We've had any number of shootings, mass casualty incidents involving guns since then. How do you move people who just see this as a right that they do not want infringed upon in any way?
You're not going to move everybody. That's not
Can
democracy.
you move anybody, I guess?
I think there are a lot of people who are gravitating now in the middle who were kind of not opinionated about it until they've started seeing these children advocate for themselves. I mean, think about what has changed in the political landscape with little ones coming to Washington to advocate for themselves because the adults couldn't get it done.
Yeah.
These are differences in, I think, the political landscape. You're not going to get the highest enthusiast of the Second Amendment to be the person that comes on your team, or you're not going to get the NRA to come on your team, or someone like Cornyn who has an A+ rating with the NRA to come on your team. But that's when it's time for a leadership change. And you have to realize what time it is. And in this case, if you would rather have an alignment or an A+ rating with the NRA rather than to save and protect the lives of the people who voted you into office, I think it's time for you to go.
You understand that as a member of the Houston City Council, you're talking to a constituency that more or less, not everybody, probably shares your view on this issue. But if you're the United States Senator from Texas, you're representing a very big state with a divergent set of opinions, and you're going to have to represent people who agree with you and don't. That's why I'm asking how you bring people into that conversation and how you win them over.
Yeah, and I think
it's dime box and mule shoe where you need to go and have that conversation, not Acres Homes and not West Houston, right? I mean, that's the problem and the challenge for somebody in your position.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just like anything else. You have to come and treat people's issue with respect. I mean, you have to understand that the reasons that somebody else, like in a more rural setting, may want a gun is a little bit different than maybe the framework that we're talking about when we're talking about urban gun violence. But that doesn't mean that the issue is not the issue that needs to be discussed
or that you can't have the conversation.
Correct.
So you talked about the economy a second ago, and I put you off. I want to come back to that. So you do call out as one of the core priorities in your campaign the need to strengthen the economy, and not just to that's very interesting, not just to strengthen the urban economy. You have, again, been a city council member in a fast-growing urban area, largest urban area in Texas, fourth largest in the country. And you've correctly said, the job picture is great in Texas, but most of the job growth has been in the urban areas. There are still 1.5 million people living in rural Texas today. Rural Texas will still be a thing, even though so much of the population of Texas today and tomorrow will live in the big cities. And so you've talked about how do we strengthen the rural parts of our economy? How do we bring broadband access to more places? Talk about that, because that's not a very sexy campaign priority. It's kind of foundational infrastructure stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I'm interested to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, I'm kind of a meat and potatoes type of person. We got to get the fundamentals right. And so if you've got millions of people in your state that don't have access to internet because we don't have the infrastructure, that means they don't have access to jobs. That means they don't have access to education opportunities, virtual work. So we have to get people connected. That's number one, I think. And it's not, let me say this, because this is a misnomer. A lot of people just think that's relegated to rural markets. In cities, there's a lack of broadband internet connectivity as well, and people don't know that. It's not the news story of the day.
Well, especially in communities of color, access to broadband at home is much lower than access to Anglo households, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one element of it. Number two, when we know, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but Texas is number one for rural hospital closures in the nation.
Correct.
And so how do you address that concern? Because number one, it's a public health issue. Because if you're having a heart attack or you're having some kind of life-altering or life-threatening condition emerge, you have nowhere to go. We have to make sure that we have enough and adequate resources so that the rural hospital infrastructure is supported. Partly how to do that is make sure that everybody in your rural market isn't someone who needs public assistance or indigent care. You've got to make sure that some people have access to coverage. So how do you do that? Well, we talk about the tax policies of the day. We use our tax policies also to incentivize the behaviors that we want to see. And so why not incentivize jobs that are sustainable wage-paying jobs instead of them being located overseas or something located where they are? Provide incentives for them to be in places that have seen economic downturn so that you're connecting people to jobs where they are.
You mean like call centers, for instance?
It can be a call center
could be located
but if
in
you
rural
have
communities.
a sustainable wage paying, I'm not suggesting for people just to have below minimum, minimum wage work.
Well, in fact, you called for the minimum wage to be increased.
Yes, I believe that as well. But you also need to make sure that there are benefits associated with some of these jobs so that the pressure to provide health care access isn't so immense that those hospitals have to close. And I will say, we don't think about it just in terms of healthcare, because for many of those areas, as well as mine, I'm from Houston, where we've got the largest medical center in the world. This is a huge employer system. It's a huge employer base. So when you can get to issues that kind of let you break down some of the silos, so that's jobs and that's healthcare when you deal with that issue. Or the fact that Texas is #1 for uninsured Americans. I mean, that's a ridiculous situation that we are facing, some of which is self-imposed because they wouldn't accept the Medicaid expansion on the state level.
Which you're for.
Of course.
Right.
Of course. I'm always going to be for just doing right by people. And I think sometimes we allow politics and the power plays that are happening in Washington to blind us from the real work that needs to be done, which is, how would you want your grandma treated? How would you want your parent to be treated, rather than who wasn't responsible for that law and I'm going to go against it because of that?
Councilmember, we're talking about CDBGs and we're talking about rural broadband. Where are the shiny objects in this campaign? Give me some shiny objects. I want to ask you about the shiny objects that you're going to be asked about by voters in the next, 6 weeks. We can do this as a game show speed round if you want, but I need to ask you.
Do I win a prize?
No,
I win
no
the election because I win.
The prize is not having to spend time with me past 9 o'clock. Green New Deal, yes or no?
No.
No, why?
I think we.
Yeah, you're real progressive.
Yeah.
Green New Deal, no, why?
Okay, I think what we can certainly make strides, I think, on a universal basis to make strides that we're moving our environment into the space and place where we need to go. I think the package known as the New Deal can be somewhat polarizing, and I think we've got to stay away from the polarization. I think we're getting into a space where the packaging and the branding and the naming, we dealt with this locally with sanctuary cities, right? And so the name or the label as such was the lightning rod. Well,
Well, you either agreed with but Councilmember, you either agreed with the state's view of this or you didn't, though, right?
I think it's
whatever
a little more.
Whatever you call it what you want, but you either agreed or you didn't agree.
I think it's a little bit less of that type of proposition. I think it's a little bit more of a question of where you invest your resources and carry, and how do you actually act on the ground.
Of course, the fundamental component of the Green New Deal is an acceptance that climate change and climate science are real.
Correct, and I agree.
Topics that we need to consider to be legitimate topics of discussion and drivers of policy, given the direction that those issues are going to take us over the next number of years.
Correct.
You're not.
I'm in agreement with that. I don't say that we have to have this full package in this way in order for us to drive in that direction. Generally, those principles I'm in agreement with. Yeah. But would I say I'm in alignment with making sure that all of these boxes get checked or else? No, I would not say that.
Yeah. Free college for all, free college for some, or free college for none?
My stance, and one of the things I'm very adamant about, is making sure that we are providing access to education, which is now escaping people because of the high cost of tuition. I think through the federal government, we can tie to the grant dollars that go to public institutions and private institutions, tie to that cost controls. That doesn't mean that it's now free to everyone, but I do think that there needs to be some cost controls, obvious loan forgiveness, which are programs that are already underway, but I think the cost controls are the way to go, as opposed to saying we're going to take on that debt of saying all education is now free.
So it sounds like you're saying free college for no one.
Yes, but reduced.
Reduced is the thing. But you understand that the debate has been free college for everybody.
Yes, I understand.
Free college for everybody who's not from a wealthy family where you can afford to pay for it. But you actually take the next step and say, no, we should not have free college. We should just make college more affordable.
Correct.
That's it. Marijuana reform. This is a hot topic in Texas right now, as you may know. Since the laws around hemp were changed in the legislature, there has been some difficulty within the law enforcement community of distinguishing between small amounts of marijuana in traffic stops or other encounters with individuals and hemp. And so some counties like Austin, Travis County, for instance, have said basically we're going to get out of the business of prosecuting low-level marijuana possessions. The number of marijuana prosecutions in this state in the last year has plummeted as a consequence of this. Yeah. You know this debate is happening all over the country. Texas, as a state, remains one of 17 states where marijuana is still fully illegal. What do you do?
I think it's a waste of resources to continue to go in the direction of prosecute and introduce people to the criminal justice system as a result of low quantities of marijuana.
Right.
I don't think it's consistent with the direction of the country. I think we're moving slowly in that direction. It's just that we haven't caught up yet.
Would you legalize marijuana?
I would be comfortable with that. I mean, certainly with certain conditions and constraints like anything else in regulatory paradigm, but
Right.
I would be comfortable with that because of the fact that I don't think when you look at what's happening in the industrial prison complex and how many people are incarcerated in some of these offenses, that to me doesn't rise to the level of what should constitute whether or
Right.
not you're behind bars for
Right.
years and years and years.
Councilmember, you have experience with the criminal justice system, having worked at Harvard at its Criminal Justice Institute. This is a locus for discussions about criminal justice reform, what's appropriate and what's not. So let me ask you a little bit about that. I mean, this is another one of those shiny objects that I haven't heard you talk much about on the campaign trail, but is in the middle of the political conversation right now. We're at a moment where criminal justice reform is legitimately a bipartisan issue in this country. So let's talk about reforming broken aspects of the system. Last night, Texas carried out the first execution of 2020 in the country. We have 7 other executions currently scheduled between now and May. Should we get rid of the death penalty? Should we look at a moratorium? What do you think about that issue?
I think we should get rid of this death penalty. I am 100% against the death penalty. I believe that we live in a country in which mistakes are made and people's lives are lost as a result. We do not have a full a great process by which people are being vetted in terms of who gets the death penalty and the like.
You don't have confidence in that part of the system.
Get rid of it.
Right. Bail reform, a lot of discussion in Texas and elsewhere about reforming the bail system.
Yes, I'm from Harris County.
Right.
Where
you know well
that's
that
ground
conversation.
zero.
Right,
People often think of, and this is just my overarching commentary on the criminal justice system, which I think fails us all. I don't think it just fails the people who are in it. I think it fails us all as a society. I think it's all about retribution, and it's punitive. There's no emphasis on rehabilitation. And there's also the issue of injustices based on your economic means. And so in that case, when people say, well, you've got this cash bail or you don't, and make those determinations, that person could lose their job. They have not been tried or found to be guilty. They could lose their jobs. Their children can be made to suffer as a result because they don't have the money to be released. And I think that we have to really reevaluate what are the community implications of these actions that we take. We always look at it as an individual because there's one person at that arraignment standing there. Maybe their lawyer too, if they have one.
Right, if they have one.
If they have one, which many people do not.
Right.
And so in that context, I think the community needs to be standing there because at the end of the day, that's who gets impacted by what happens with these decisions, and I think it's unjust.
Councilmember, you said that people are treated differently based on their socioeconomic circumstances. There are a lot of people who would just say, actually, the system is racist. That it's not about socioeconomic status, but it's about race. Do you believe that the criminal justice system in this country discriminates on the basis of race?
I think it's more covert than that. I mean, it's always it's baked in. It's kind of like how Dr. King in the poor people's movement, and it's all baked in. It's hard to separate all the time when there's racial implications or pure racism. Certainly, there's a little bit. There's a mix of things that are happening.
But you're not prepared to go there and say that that's the case.
I mean, I think in some instances there are, and then of course when you think about like offhand, when you think about what's happening on an administering of the justice or the law, certainly there are those.
And you look at the statistics,
and look
it's
at
hard
what
to argue.
happens with racial profiling.
Hard to argue with the numbers. Right?
Yeah, racial profiling, or the fact that if you look at the statistics of who gets incarcerated and who gets prosecuted, I mean, there's certainly those elements. Now, is it written into law that it has to be someone who's of darker hue? No, of course not. But that's not how racism oftentimes presents itself.
Would you restore voting rights to former felons?
Yes.
To felons, pardon me. Texas is one of 21 states that does not allow people who've been incarcerated to vote. You would restore voting rights. You're running against, in the primary, council member, a field of 11, but for all practical purposes, there's an upper tier of 4 or 5. Different kinds of experience in and out of office. There were 2 former Houston City Council members who are running. You have somebody who served with distinction in the military, has never been in elective office, although she sought office once before. How do you distinguish yourself? Is it personal narrative? I mean, I'm trying to understand how you get through this primary. One of the challenges you have is there's 48 days until the primary. There's just over a month until the start of early voting. Nobody knows who you people are, right? We've polled this race. More than 50% of the people polled say they have no idea about these candidates. Everyone's name ID is down around their ankles, right? I think we asked in November, the last time we polled this race, how many people had heard of you, council member? 16% of the people in this poll had heard of you, How do you distinguish yourself within that realm?
Yeah, I think those are excellent questions. I think what we have focused on is what matters to people. And what matters most to people isn't necessarily just my personal narrative. I mean, certainly people have to get to know you, but what matters to them is that your life will be different as a result of making this selection. And that's the message that we have been trying to impart to people, because that, in fact, will change us from where we are today in a democracy that doesn't work for a lot of us, and where we will be. The reason I brought up that instance of me going on the doorstep and the woman saying, or the folks saying to me, "Are you here and is it re-election?" Those folks, when we looked at the 18 cycle, we saw that persuadable voters turned out in very high levels. Those are the suburban voters. But the communities of color that had registered in high levels didn't come back out in high levels. In fact, they were under 50% of their registered numbers. Same thing happened with 35-year-olds and younger. And if you can be a messenger that can say to that person, because this is what's going to matter in terms of who actually casts a vote and turns out. If you can say to them, when they say, oh, it's not going to matter, because usually that's a motivation challenge, right? If you can say to them, it will matter, and they say, well, why should I believe you? Your answer should be, because here is evidence of how it's been different in my community or the community I've served. I'm the messenger in this race. I'm the only person in this race that can say that and position all of the coalitions needed in order to win. One key question hasn't been asked today is who can beat John Cornyn? I think that's a relevant question, because I am the only person in this race that can actually beat him, because I can get those persuadable voters, because I can get those community of colors, voters in communities of color to turn out, and the 35-year-olds and younger. And if you can get all of those coalitions built, then you will be able to have enough
Wouldn't
votes to
Senator
win.
West, who's been in the Texas Senate for more than a quarter century, African-American, very strong ties to the black community in Texas, be able to also say plausibly, I can get communities of color to turn out? Wouldn't Christina Cincin Ramirez, whose last job was running JOLT Texas, an organization designed for the purpose of turning out Hispanic Texans, be able to say plausibly, I have an access point with the communities of color? And also, you and Ms. Ramirez are both 37. You're both young. You're millennials in this race. You're the youngest candidates running. Are you not in a better position to reach young people, both of you, not just you?
You have to get those three coalitions. So I'll go back. Persuadable voters, those folks in the middle. Remember I talked about pro-growth? That's key to that. If you can't get those persuadable voters, if you do one, if you're too far to the left and not able to get those people in the middle, you won't have enough votes to win. If you can't get those young people ignited and excited,
won't have enough votes.
You won't have enough votes. You've got to get the persuadables, you've got to get folks, communities of color, and you've got to get folks who are under the age of 35. And if you can do all three, you will be able to have the math to work.
Do the persuadables include people who are soft Republicans, people who typically vote independent, who are not hard-won Republican votes, but people who might be thinking at the moment, maybe we need a change? Are you going to go after those voters?
That's a huge part of this new contingency of independent voters in Texas. Have you noted, that's noteworthy in terms of the number of people who are self-identified.
Well, there are some people who think, I just want to win this on our side of the field. You're actually willing to reach people over,
I'm willing to reach Texans, because Texans deserve
regardless of party. Do endorsements matter in terms of winning this primary? It was obviously noted in the middle of December that the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee got off the sidelines and endorsed M.J. Hager in this race. Does that kind of an endorsement matter? What do you think of that?
I think it's unfortunate that the DSCC doesn't believe that Texans can decide who their own leaders are. Now, I happen to be from this state.
Of course, if they had endorsed you, council member, you would have been perfectly happy to take the endorsement. You wouldn't be complaining about the federal government, Washington getting involved.
I will say this about that issue, because number one, I think in a primary context where, as you mentioned, the number one, the front runner in this race is undecided, right? So that's the front runner. For them to try to tip the scales in this way, I think is completely inappropriate in the way that they've done it, particularly in light of the fact that the equation needed in this time requires you to be able to galvanize more of the base. If we just go alongside this persuadable voters model, we won't have enough votes necessary in order to win. We have got to galvanize more of the base if we want to beat John Cornyn, which in fact is the point.
So a national endorsement like that does not matter. Local endorsements, local support matters. Right. Let me ask you about this. You served in Houston. You're a well-known lawyer, public servant in Houston, and yet Senator Royce West has Congressman Al Green, Senator Carol Alvarado, John Whitmire, Alma Allen, Harold Dutton, Ron Reynolds. I know you have Beyonce's mother.
Don't undercut Tina Knowles' lawsuit.
No. She was willing to put a ring on it. I agree. I mean, that's good. But But seriously, what does it tell me about the people who know you well in Houston, nonetheless supported Senator West? What about that?
I think this is exactly what my campaign is about, which is not about the politics. My campaign, the first campaign I ran when I got more votes than anybody running for office at that time, was also similar. I went to the people. It's the people that matter. That's who you're serving. You're not serving the other elected officials. I'm not accountable to other elected officials. I think that type of emphasis on elected officials or this leadership paradigm rather than going direct to people.
This gets back to your people.
The problem, yes. And I ran my first race the exact same way. I didn't have a long list. I was considered an outsider. I didn't have this long list of endorsements. But we got more votes than anybody running for office at that time because we went directly to people.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, the fact is, whether it's Ron Reynolds or John Whitmire, they have the same one vote as everybody else.
That's
in Houston,
correct.
right? As it
That's
turns
correct.
out. A couple of process things before we open it up for questions. You have called out a couple times the general principle that politicians don't own seats, people do. I hear in that potentially support for term limits. Would you say that there is a period of time in which it is too long to serve, and would you commit, since you wouldn't own the seat that you'd win, to serving only for a period of time and then handing off the baton to somebody else?
I'll say two things to that. I come from a term-limited seat. I wasn't at my term limit after I vacated.
You got out, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I am in a term-limited context where it's 2 4-year terms. I do think it allows people to have fresh views, fresh perspectives. There's always a downside. The downside of that is, of course, you lose institutional knowledge.
Cornyn's been in right now as we sit here for 17 years.
Yeah, but I think the answer is deeper than that. I think the answer, it really is about really empowering people to take their power back. One of the things that I loved about President Obama's statements when he was leaving office was when he was talking about how the power lies in the hands of the average, ordinary American citizen. And if we really take that power that we do possess, realize that we possess it, harness that, and hold all of us, and I always say this to my residents, hold all of us accountable. Don't let me come in and with a big bright smile and charm you. It's about what I've done. And if you don't see that line or that connectivity or those results that we talk about, it's time for us to go.
Vote me out of office. You have term limits. They're called elections.
They're called elections. Right. I would be supportive of exploring term limits. I'm not opposed to that at all.
But you're not committing to only serve a certain number of terms.
I'm not. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that I need to be there for 40 years either.
Got it.
I definitely think having the fresh blood is a good thing. I don't know, I think it's a question that needs to be studied. They studied it on a city council because they changed it.
But you're not there one side or another right now.
Right, exactly. But I'm open to that.
Senator Cornyn has as much money in his campaign account and has raised as much money as all of you combined. In the third quarter, for someone who is relatively new on this statewide scene, you actually did pretty well in raising money. You raised more than $550,000, all of it from contributions, I understand. No loans, right?
No loans.
No loans. Which, other than MJ Hager, was the most that anybody had raised in that quarter. Fourth quarter is now closed. We're not supposed to find out until the 31st how much you raised in the fourth quarter, but you will tell me, because I invited you here, right?
Now, Evan,
How much did you raise?
Evan, I'm not going to tell you that.
Come on.
You have to wait.
Okay, let me ask you this. Let's just do this. Does it begin with a 5?
I'm not going to tell you that, Evan. Evan, you can't get the dims early.
Well, the fact is that it's a show of your strength in this race if you outraise in the fourth quarter what you raised in the third quarter. Blink once for yes, twice for no.
Do you see what I have to deal with, guys?
It's like a hostage video. Come on. You're not going to say.
I'm not going to say.
Does money matter in this race? Texas is a very expensive place to run. I mean, I said this to other people sitting here during this race, that, if I'm a potential donor to a Senate campaign in Texas, why is my money, and I'm more concerned about the national picture, we want to retain control of the Senate, or win back control of the Senate, because of Supreme Court justices, because of all the things that control of the Senate would mean. Wouldn't my money be better spent in Colorado to defeat Cory Gardner, or in Arizona to defeat Martha McSally, or in Alabama to keep Doug Jones, rather than spending the money on what may be to some a lower priority Senate race in Texas?
I think what you're seeing in terms of the dollars that are being raised, particularly on the Democratic side, is that question is being asked a lot. Yeah. And I think what people are concluding is that, let me wait until the primary's over, and then I'm all in. So it's not a writing off of Texas. It's really just a...
Pause, hit the pause.
Yeah, so you're seeing a lot of people pause. Plus, it's unprecedented to have 12 of us in this race.
True.
Right? So that's creating a lot of, I think, angst for people. I think the differential, there is a big gap between what Cornyn has and what the Democratic candidates have currently on hand, but I think that gap gets completely eliminated once this primary
Democratic
is over.
nominee will maybe not have as much money as Cornyn, but may have enough.
I think the Democratic nominee will have more.
Because
the DS, I mean, all of these entities are waiting to get into this race. I mean, the Emily's Lists of the world, all of them have not gotten in at this point in this race due to the contested nature of this primary.
So they get off the sidelines after the primary.
And what I think it will happen is that they will, because Texas is listed as one of the target states to flip so that the balance of power shifts in this country. So people are going to have a vested interest. I think it'll be a really fascinating contrast between me and John.